Yesterday, I had a 2v1 debate against both Destiny and LonerBox on what solutions might look like in Gaza. Destiny just uploaded it in full on his main channel. If you're interested, it's linked below. This is written though, so viewing the debate itself first is not necessary. There was actually a lot of agreement. Both of them agreed that Hamas, of course, is a terrorist organization, a dictatorship that murders civilians, Israelis, and often Gazans as well. One that's more interested in showering its leadership in the lap of luxury, living in penthouse palaces 1,000 miles away in Qatar. Billionaires off of stolen funds taken from a population, 47% of them children who can barely scrape together enough food and water to survive day by day as their dictators dig up water pipes to use as rockets, hiding behind those very same innocent Gazan civilians as they attempt to murder Israelis, to murder Jews. I told them both in no uncertain terms that the status quo in Gaza is not acceptable. Over 1,000 Israelis were murdered. Hundreds were stolen from their beds and are now being marched around, displayed as trophies of moral bankruptcy. Grandmothers, babies, kept underground for weeks on end, marched around miles and miles of underground tunnels, used as human shield, their very access to the sunlight stripped from them. And the truth is, the treatment by Hamas of Israelis and of Jews pales in comparison to their treatment, their decade-long dictatorship over the innocent people of Gaza. Hamas is evil. This conflict is complicated, but some things are very simple. Hamas is evil. Martin Luther King once said, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice." Peace in Gaza, true peace, the presence of justice, will not take place until Hamas is vanquished. And yet, the truth is, Israel can't do that. Not alone, and frankly, I think there's strong reason to believe that Israel can't even do that with the support of the United States and all her allies. In the debate yesterday, I compared the situation in Gaza to the situation under the Taliban of Afghanistan. 20 years. That war took 20 years. The United States was embroiled in the longest and one of the most bloody and ultimately most fruitless wars in our history as a nation, from, ironically enough, October 7th of 2001, following 9/11, until finally, 20 years later, after the failures of no fewer than 3 former administrations, Joe Biden had the bravery to reject the status quo. He knew as well as anyone that for the United States to end the war, to change the status quo, would mean bloodshed, would require difficult conversations, would require difficult choices, require difficult elections, and handling hard political pressures. He knew as well as anyone, better than anyone, that the Taliban would likely come back to power upon that withdrawal. And yet, he also knew that if we delayed the inevitable by another decade, with another $1 trillion of taxpayer money wasted, another 1,000 American soldiers dead, another 1,000,000 innocent Afghans displaced, we knew what was coming. Everyone knew what was coming. It was no secret. The Taliban were not going to be defeated. Kept out of power? Yes, but defeated? No. There is a difference between the absence of tension and the presence of justice. There is a difference between an Afghanistan then or a Gaza now that is without Hamas control and one that is without Hamas. Israel can, and particularly with the backing of the United States could, create a circumstance within Gaza that is without Hamas control. But they cannot rid Gaza of Hamas. It's not true. There are 300 plus miles of tunnels used by Hamas littered across densely populated northern Gaza. Israel cannot destroy them all. Israel cannot even find them all. There are 200 plus Israeli civilians, including of them 30 children, being held hostage against their will, some of them tortured, all of them, stripped from their lives, all of them, their mothers, their fathers, their children, their grandchildren, in tears, desperate for nothing more than a few fleeting moments to hug their family goodbye before their all too likely demise. Israel cannot free them all. It's not going to happen. I wish that it could, but it won't. The sad reality is that it is much easier to destroy something than it is to build. It is much easier to terrorize while hiding behind innocent Gazan children, shooting rockets at Tel Aviv, than it is to free them. And yet freedom is their right. The status quo is untenable. When I spoke to Destiny and LonerBox, their shared position, was that Gazan kids should grow up under the same dictatorship forever with no end in sight. When Destiny tells you, that Israel has a right to do targeted strikes, but that ultimately they don't have a similar right to actually take back military control of Gaza, what he is saying in no uncertain terms is that Israel should accept this day by day, week by week, year, decade by decade, tit for tat, where Hamas, hiding behind children as they do it, shoot rockets that as technology grows better and more affordable will hit all the more often into future, as Iran grows more and more ambitious in their funding of terror, as day by day Palestinians rightly recognize that their plight is untenable, and far too many growing up under the boot of a propaganda-ridden dictatorship, recognizing rightly that their children are without fresh drinking water. We are asking for October 7th to happen again. In Judaism, there is an all too often repeated concept: never again. Originally, it was in response to the Holocaust, but it bears repeating. October 7th, we are on track to see it happen again. If Destiny and if LonerBox, if people who are acting in good faith and who are genuinely interested, genuinely worried about the plight of Gazans, the plight too of Israelis and of Palestinians in the West Bank, if the small minority of us who genuinely do want to see a real peace, who are willing to sacrifice on its behalf, who are willing to see beyond the headlines, to do the work of understanding the situation we find ourselves in, if we are to work together towards a peace in the presence of justice, not just the absence of tension, if we are to see that peace, someone must be brave. One side or the other must accept the massive, tectonic, perhaps career-ending, most certainly life-threatening burden of making that first move towards the presence of justice. Hamas will not be that first mover. Fatah might. They are by no stretch a perfect actor. They are by no stretch without their flaws, but they might be interested, genuinely interested, in finding a solution that permits both Jews and Muslims, Palestinians and Israelis to live in a peace of justice. But Fatah isn't in control over the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is controlled by a terrorist dictatorship, and shooting at the terrorist dictatorship won't change that fact. Israel can take out a couple commanders. They might, if they're lucky, even be able to free some small minority of the Israeli hostages. If they're lucky, they might destroy a few tunnels, but they're not going to end Hamas. It can't happen. I know that. Destiny knows that. LonerBox knows that. The Biden administration knows that. Israel knows that. And Hamas, as well as their backers in Iran, are counting on that. We all know that Hamas can't be taken out in a couple of strikes, or even thousands. But we can end the dictatorship. It's unpopular to say that, or rather, it's popular to say that so long as you don't admit what would actually be required to get there. To end the dictatorship of Hamas requires that Israel occupy Gaza. It requires that the entire strip return to a system not unlike that of Area C in the West Bank. Complete civil and complete military control by the IDF. That's unpopular to say. I get it. It's really unpopular to say. I understand why it's unpopular to say. And I wish I didn't feel the need to say it, but I do. Because someone needs to. There cannot be a peace negotiation when the other side of the negotiating table literally in its charter demands the death of every single civilian, not even government official, but civilian who lives in Israel, or even who, like me, has absolutely no affiliation with Israel, but is simply tainted by birth with the dirt of Judaism. To get to peace, Hamas cannot be in control, and yet they cannot be completely wiped out, and therefore, the only solution is occupation. But that's not a genuine resolution. That's a first step, and it's a horrible one. Necessary, yes, but not sufficient. So what is step two? Step two is to buckle down, because now, after the ground invasion is over, after the terrorists have been forced underground, after the Iranian backers, the Qatari billionaires have been put squarely outside of the auspices of power, then, in step two, that's when the real work begins. where the real struggle towards true and lasting justice starts. Step 2 is that you have elections. Not just in the Strip either, no. You have elections across the totality, both of Gaza and of Area C controlled, both civil and military occupied West Bank. Not of Area A, nor of Area B. The area is controlled already by the Palestinian Authority, already by Fatah. They should not change hands, at least not yet, despite Fatah also being a dictatorship, despite Fatah also being corrupt, despite it also having many flaws, because Fatah is not, in spite of all that, guilty of October 7th. And Fatah is not, in spite of all of that, actively and presently engaged in chronic terrorism. What I'm describing is going to be hard, very hard. Israel will be forced to decipher what borders are deemed for what towns. They'll have to decide which people, Jewish settlers in particular, are and are not eligible to vote. It will require citizenship to be provided. A citizenship of what exactly? A citizenship of named Palestine under the existing Palestinian Authority? Is this meant to be seen in conjunction with the existing quasi-government of the PLO? A citizenship of named Gaza? Will it require that if a person with an existing Israeli citizenship wishes to be part of these elections, that they renounce their Israeli citizenship? How about people with a Jordanian citizenship? Probably not that second one. And yet Jews, even non-Israeli citizen Jews, have at least historically been granted a speed-lined entry into Israel. And so perhaps exceptions should be made wherein these Jews who accept this newfound Palestinian citizenship of the West Bank Area C, as it slowly begins the long process towards becoming an Area B-style fledgling democracy, perhaps they must give up their right of return. And yet, should non-Jewish Arabs who were forced to flee in the Nakba, or whose family before them experienced that same historic cleansing, should they have to give up any future possibility of return, just as in the case of these, the Jews of Judea, the Jews who would be expected to give up their birthright citizenship of Israel? Perhaps to that, the answer also would have to be yes, in order to see one's voice included in these elections. But it's hard. Democracy is hard. It's hard even in the United States with a centuries-long, albeit very imperfect tradition. It is much harder still in a place like the West Bank, and even further more difficult in a place like Gaza. But it must be the future that we fight for. The future of status quo is not tenable. If America cares, if you care about the future of Palestinians, you need to be goal-oriented. You need to be serious about it. When the status quo was, even prior to October 7th, even prior to this mass displacement it has caused, 1.32 million people, 66% of the population of Gaza, according to the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, described as being in need, with up to 50% unemployment, with over 50% direct dependence on foreign aid, another 20% on top of that receiving substantial but not complete aid. This is not a status quo worth getting back to. It is not a status quo where thousands of rockets are shot at Tel Aviv and the response is to, at $60,000 a pop, shoot down most but not all of them out of the sky, firing in return to take out the terrorists, or rather to take out their equipment, because to fail to give them warning would inevitably result in the death of the innocent civilians, many of them, perhaps even most of them, literally children, being held by terrorists as human shield. This is not an acceptable status quo. Israel needs to, 1, invade and take military control away from the terrorists. During that time, as well as this time currently, it needs to keep detailed lists of exactly what and where is being destroyed by their military in terms of civilian infrastructure. And infrastructure, even that may be partially but not exclusively civilian infrastructure. It's a war. It's a war against terrorists who chronically use human shields. The fact of the matter is, the destruction of civilian infrastructure is inevitable if Israel is to defend herself, and if perhaps even more important, Israel is to free the innocent Gazans from the clutches of a dictatorship whose depravity may very well go unmatched anywhere else on earth. But perhaps for North Korea, if even there, if Israel is to defeat Hamas, there will be innocent Gazans caught in the crossfire. The details of who, where, When and how, those details must be logged prior to this partial victory, the victory only above ground, the forcing of Hamas below and into hiding, but not out of order, not without the capacity to wreak havoc into the future. It is then that, too, once that partial freedom of Area C type control has finally been won by Israel against Hamas, that then they must, in addition to elections, which will of course be difficult. Elections ideally run through the UN, but to be clear, the UN's legacy in Gaza, its legacy in this conflict as a whole, is mixed, is complicated, is not without reason for distrust, but they are the closest to a trusted third party that could exist. And they should oversee elections in which they would attempt and likely again succeed in engaging once more in terrorism against those brave and long-forgotten Gazan civilians whose rights and whose freedoms have been stolen from them for a decade, for in many cases the totality of their lives. That has to happen. And in tandem to it, a court must be set up. And this is where the United States' involvement is crucial. This is where our pressure, the pressure you can wield on your own senators, on your own congresspeople, on the Biden administration, this is where you need to call for the United States to actually support, in dollars, in real money, in real political pressure, that a court be set up with Israeli justices, yes, but also with justices ideally from Jordan and from Egypt, and perhaps even one designated by the UN, who would oversee the allocation of reparations paid for at least in part by the United States, for those infrastructural losses of innocent civilians harmed during the war on Hamas. That has to be part of the resolution of this awful circumstance. So too, as part of any real piece of justice, there must be water filtration. There must be a pathway towards the freedom of movement in and out of Israel proper, perhaps even more important, between, at the very least in terms of short-term visitation rights, Gaza and the West Bank. None of this is easy. None of this will be simple. But it's a pathway that I see as possible. Narrowly so, difficult, costly, but possible. If you believe that a different pathway towards a piece of justice is possible, explain it. Genuinely explain it, whether in this comment section or in another, whether in an article or in an email or in a dissertation, explain it in detail. Explain it in a way that you believe can get us not necessarily to a perfect solution, but from where we are, which is untenable, to something that puts us on a trajectory towards something better. When Destiny and LonerBox, and all too often, and perhaps more importantly, the audience, throw up their hands and state the obvious fact that, of course, any resolution to the situation is an uphill battle. State the obvious fact that, of course, if Hamas were simply to make that first brave step of attempting in good faith to put up us on a path towards peace, yes, of course, that would make all of this simple. But in the absence of the simple, easy choices, we need to start being realistic about what hard choices might look like.